Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, welcome to this week's first edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show tonight, no flying chairs this time around, but plenty to read from the ANC's Eastern Cape Elective Conference about the state of the governing party ahead of its December elective conference. We look at the conference Cyril Ramaphosa says is the one to energize the Congress movement. But first, energy racism. That's the title of a damning University of Johannesburg report on the impact of the electricity crisis on the working class across the country's townships. We speak to the authors. The Watchdog starts now. University of Johannesburg researchers have produced a damning report on the impact of the electricity crisis on the lives of South Africa's working class people. On the line to speak to us about it is one of the authors, UJ academic and longtime activist, Dr. Trevor Ngwane. Also joining in the conversation is an energy expert familiar with the report, and that is Ted Bloom. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Will.
Dr. Ngwane, if you will, just take us through very briefly sort of what gave rise to this report, how it was compiled, who was involved, and what the point of it all was.
Well, Vuyo, we found that a lot of research into the electricity crisis in South Africa tended to be policy-oriented. It also tended to look at the top of the class structure so that policymakers, politicians, university professors had the greatest say over what the electricity crisis means. So we decided to go to the ground and find out how ordinary people, firstly, experience the crisis, secondly, cope with it, and thirdly, how they respond, what solutions they actually provide. And
what did you find?
Well, as you know, we academics, we also try and summarize our research findings in terms of concepts. So the most appropriate concept we came up with was energy racism. I know it sounds harsh, but basically what is going on, Vuyo, is that there is structural racism. In fact, there are continuities with the apartheid past, so that Black working class communities are bearing the brunt of the energy crisis in South Africa, hence energy racism.
Ted Bloom, were you surprised? I mean, reading this report, did the findings come as any surprise?
Absolutely not. Good evening. I'm a bit disappointed because I've gone through the report, and while it's quite a lot of detail as to how the people are impacted by the so-called energy racism, I would have hoped, and because I've had dealings with the UJ Faculty of Economics previously, I would have hoped that they maybe incorporate the bigger impact of this disaster on energy on the economy of South Africa. And let me just tell you where I'm coming from. This nonsense has been going on for more than 15 years. I was at Eskom when the first load shedding was announced in 2008. In fact, I warned about it 3 days before I was told to shut up. So Eskom is not a very sympathetic organization when it comes to load shedding or faulting their actions. But I would have thought that over the last 15 years, the research unit, maybe they were pressed for time, but they could have maybe gone more deeply into the economic impact and tragedy of job losses and closure of industry and the consequent damage to society by all this load shedding. Yes, it's very inconvenient, and people complain about not having access to electricity during crucial times before and after work, when everybody relies on support from their households to feed them and to clothe them and to clean them up. Yes, it's at the most inconvenient times, but the actual effect is minimal compared to the economic impact of losing your livelihood and having to live unemployed for your whole life. I mean, there are people, I'm told, that are older than 35 years who've never had the privilege of a job. I mean, it shouldn't even be a privilege, it should be a right. So I would have hoped, and maybe there's a second part to this research, I'm not aware of it, but yes, this report goes into a lot of detail, and I was one of the first people to call out the fact that the load shedding seemed to be disproportionate to the population and to the suburbs. I said at the time, which Eskom dismissed, that they're attacking or they're penalizing the voiceless or the people who don't have a strong voice to make their opinions known. So yes, I have great sympathy, more so with the Soweto Crisis Committee, whom I've also had dealings with in the past. And my bottom line is that we're all suffering under Eskom, maybe some parts of the population more than others, but the unemployment and the security issues and the lack of proper household life because of the damning impact of electricity shortfalls affects everybody. But yeah, I mean, I think that's enough said. But it's just caused also by the high prices. I mean, I'm on record as saying the current pricing regime since 2008 is totally corrupted. But I haven't found any takers. I mean, I've got all the work done, the research work's done, we're ready to go to court, but there seems to be nobody to put their hand up to take this matter for review to the appropriate courts. And it's going to cost, I've estimated 4 million rand. I've had some farmers come up and say they'll put up a fair whack of that. But as far as industry is concerned, they've just been compliant. They've just been dancing along the tunes of government.
But I mean, your reservations or disappointments notwithstanding, do you not think that there is value in this piece of work, especially, I mean, as Dr. Ngwane said in his opening remarks, the fact that for, I mean, for most of the time, we hardly focus on the impact of this crisis on ordinary, poor, vulnerable people. So there's really a big point in focusing on that.
No, absolutely, and I think it's a good start. As I said, I'm hoping that there will be a follow-up to this report, which will look at the wider impact, the economic impact, which affects people. You know, if you haven't got a job, you can't create a pension. You're going to be a dependent for your whole life. You're going to be a beggar for your whole life, and that's what this has caused. This electricity meltdown has melted our economy. It's killed off jobs. It's created a wasteland. I mean, South Africa has become a wasteland because of this energy shortage. And yes, it's always the case that some people will be more affected than other people, but don't make no mistake, everybody is impacted. Everybody who looked forward to a livelihood and proper employment and proper household life, where you can come home to a cooked meal after a hard day's work. Everybody's impacted by that. And yes, in this case, I think it's good that the report focuses on the poorest of the poor, but it's not endemic only to them. It's endemic to the whole of South African society, other than just Soweto and Alexandra, which are focus points in this research. And I can understand that the research was limited because it was maybe a initial inquiry, and it's in that context that I'm hoping that further work will come, and I'll be more than happy to try and contribute, because I'm very, very aware of the lost opportunities. Companies come to me and say, can we invest in South Africa? Have you got power? And I've got to be honest and say, no, we haven't got power. So yes, I'm more than happy to contribute to, if there is a follow-up to this, and to add my weight as much as possible to the situation, so that it can get to the right ears.
I'm sure, Trevor's going to talk us through some of the decisions they may have taken on the back of this particular piece of work as to what needs to happen next. But before we get there, Trevor, you did reach conclusions of your own as the research team. Just take us through some of those.
Well, in general, I agree fully with Ted Bloom. I mean, he's done, consistent critique of what is going wrong with the energy sector in South Africa. But like you say, Vuyo, it's also important to look at the impact on ordinary people. So we found that there is what I can call structural racism. So the problem with systemic inequalities is that they require a narrative to either justify them or make sense of why they exist. So, for example, with electricity, you get narratives which actually blame the victim. For example, there is a culture of non-payment. The problems of Eskom are scapegoated on the poor. There is a definite policy which targets Black working class areas, when there is a crisis of energy supply. There's a system called load reduction, which is confined only to Black working class areas, townships, shack settlements, and villages. Some, Black working class areas, in terms of maintenance, in terms of response to repairs, collapse, they can live with 3 weeks, 6 months, a year without electricity. So Black working class areas are also receiving a lesser service from Eskom and from other electricity authorities. So what you are really opposed to is the unequal treatment of Black working class areas.
But is it
the brand?
But is it by design? In other words, is there a deliberateness about what you have just described?
Yeah, I believe so. But remember, Vuyo, as researchers, as policymakers, we have to deal with intentions and outcomes. But we tend to focus on outcomes because outcomes are measurable. We can point on a map which areas actually are getting more load shedding. And we found that it's only confined to Black areas. And then we looked at Eskom's intentions. Eskom justifies this by saying we reduce those areas where there's overcrowding, we reduce those areas where there's illegal connection, we reduce those areas where people are not paying. Which areas are those? Of course, it won't be Sentin, where the rich live. It's going to be shack settlements, villages, and poor Black townships. So, intention and outcome tend to go in tandem.
I mean, you have a Black government, in this country, so it would be an indictment on them if if things were indeed happening the way you're saying they do. So, as an activist, long-time activist, is it sort of perhaps leadership lapses? Because one can't see how, a government of the ANC would sort of deliberately do what you're saying it is doing. Just what is your sense? And I'm speaking to you now as an activist. Is it because they just don't care? They don't take note. They are not focused, or are you suggesting, that they go out of their way to give the poor the raw deal that you say they're giving them?
Well, the problem is historical, Vuyo, because remember, it was black labor which laid out the pylons, of the electricity grid. It was and still is black labor which is digging out the coal, which, is feeding our electricity furnaces. But during the height of apartheid, most black areas did not have access to electricity. In fact, in Soweto, we had Orlando Power Station feeding electricity to white areas. The people in Soweto were only enjoying the fumes, the pollution. Now, that way of thinking, the idea that black people deserve less, now has changed into a class prejudice. Can you see? Especially because the ANC government has bought into supporting what I have to call the interest of white monopoly capital. We must say that why, because on the side of the ANC leadership, it is the black aspirant bourgeoisie. So during apartheid, white monopoly capital, mining magnates were paying as little as 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So they were being subsidized, in terms of electricity access. Now, under the ANC, that system, feeding the big guys is continuing because the ANC is not challenging white monopoly capital. It's trying to join them on the table. Actually, they want to be part of that exclusive club. That is why then they tend to adopt the same attitudes, the same leaders who were leading the boycott, against their payment are the ones saying, hey, you must pay. But they forget that it wasn't that they didn't want to pay. Even during apartheid, they were trying to fight a system of social injustice.
Ted Blom, I was reading Professor Patrick Bond, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg, from where this report was published. And he does go into a number of areas which have brought about this crisis, but also the behavior, of the ESCOM leadership and how they have really not helped the situation. He says this, he writes, a two-page forward, to this report. Now, from where you see it, and having dabbled on these things for many years, what are the sort of levers that still remain, that which an ESCOM and the government, can still perhaps push and pull to alleviate the suffering? And I'm talking here just about, the poorest and the most vulnerable, the people that this report is dealing with, and those are the people who live in townships. Where do you think there are still things that could be done within the current system, with all its shortcomings, that could help in alleviating the suffering on the poor in particular?
Okay, so yes, I read Professor Bond's intro or forward, and he's quite scathing in his remarks about the ESCOM leadership, and I think I share a lot of those criticisms of the ESCOM leadership. In fact, the bottom line is that ESCOM, as the president has said in his newsletter, his weekly newsletter, is part of the so-called network industries: rail, road, water, electricity, telecommunications, etc. And, it goes back to ideology. Where I was trained, your network industries need to be run mean and lean and clean so that they benefit society. And they are typically industries where private investors wouldn't normally get involved because the capex was large and took a long time to be amortized, etc. And now that is, at the time when I studied more than 30 years ago, that was trite through all the economies of the world. And then suddenly, with the advent of the ANC, we got everybody being a super manager with big titles and big salaries. And suddenly, to justify this whole thing and to turn them into profit animals, I mean, which is totally inappropriate because everybody is beholden unto these network industries. So now the ANC has turned them into profit centers and revalued the infrastructure. The infrastructure was at book value, was negligible over the years because it's all been paid off. And now suddenly you find entities like Eskom want between 8 and 16% return on investment. It's not their money, it's our money. They don't need any return on investment. And prior to 94, the Eskom was run on a cost recovery basis. So the money that went into the facilities was amortized and there was no profit margin on top of that. Yes, there was an equalization account to make up for the ups and the downs, but by and large, there was no rate of return. And if you look at Eskom today, the largest component of its cost is the rate of return and the depreciation costs. And those are both book entries that are really not needed to run a network industry. Yes, you need to have control of your assets, but you don't need to value them. I mean, all Eskom's assets are valued at a replacement value. So even an asset that's like 100 years old, that's been written off long time ago, is valued at billions. In fact, Eskom's valuation of its assets stands at over 1.5 trillion rand. And on that, on that big amount, they want interest or coupon or profit or whatever you want to call it. It's totally unsustainable. That's not the way to build it. When you do that, when you do something like that, when you increase the tariffs of network industries, what you effectively do is you kill off every other industry in the economy who doesn't have the same profitability because they cannot compete with profits that Eskom is gorging out of the economy. So if you've got a business that only makes 1 or 2% return, it might be adequate for you. It supplies you with an income for your household or whatever, and you're not the mega capitalist who wants to make 20, 30, 40, 50% profit on your items. But the moment the network industries do charge those exorbitant rates of return, you kill off every home industry in the country. Every small business in the country, every business that can't manage a 10 or 20% profit rate is killed off. And that is just stupid. And we've seen that it's called the commodities curse. In a lot of commodities countries, you get one commodity, like in this country, it used to be gold. So everybody was focused on managing the gold industry, and all the other industries were neglected. Why? Because they said, no, well, gold is the most important industry. When you run a balanced economy, you need to have balanced interests across the spectrum so that your farmers, your DIY home owners and builders, your small businesses can all survive and look after themselves. But when you do the things that the government has done to the network industries, you impoverish everybody and you put everybody on the dole or on some handouts or something, and you end up with massive unemployment. This is foreseen. This is not something that's unforeseen, but it comes back to your ideology. You know, if you want to have a capitalist ideology at all costs, well, then you do what the ANC has done to the network industry. You price them out of the reach of the average person, and you say, well, I'm only going to look after the very wealthy, the uber wealthy, the blue light brigade oaks and those guys, and to hell with the rest of my citizens. Now, that isn't a responsible way. In fact, I would say that 99% of the people who voted for the ANC didn't vote for that type of treatment.
Trevor, Professor Bond takes issue, for example, with Eskom CEO De Ruyter, who says cuts power to townships and poor municipalities, uses scarce resources to pay foreign banks which made corrupt loans to Eskom. De Ruyter continued special pricing arrangements that give two of the world's biggest mining houses, South 32 and Anglo, electricity costing a tenth of the tariff charged to residential customers. Now, as a team that worked on this report, you made some recommendations, or you're making pronouncements about what communities could still do, and what the working class, the subject of this particular study, could also do. Take us through just a couple of those in conclusion.
Yeah, well, firstly, let me agree fully with Ted Bloom. The problem at Eskom is actually privatization, commercialization, and financialization, which means that electricity is no longer viewed as a basic necessity which everyone must access, but is there to make money for the privileged few, for white monopoly capital, and for the aspirant black bourgeoisie. So what we are calling for is an end to the misery, the suffering, the hardship, faced by grannies, faced by women who must go out, and collect firewood in dangerous areas because they don't have access to clean, safe, reliable, and affordable energy. We think that the discrimination of black working class areas, especially, the poorest of the poor, should stop. Everyone must have access to safe energy. And really, we do recommend looking seriously at exploring renewable energy sources, which are socially owned, socially controlled, which are not there to make a profit for a few, but to benefit society as a whole.
And that's what we're going to leave it this evening. Special thanks to both of you, Dr. Trevor Ngwana there, who is one of the authors of this report entitled Energy Racism. It looks at the impact of the electricity crisis on the poor who are living in the country's townships. Ted Bloom, who is, of course, also an expert in the energy field. He's also been a very vocal critic of, the government Eskom's treatment of this particular crisis. After the break,
let us have a broader discussion about what qualifies an ANC member to be a leader of our movement. Yes.
A review of the ANC conference, ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa says, is the one to energize his party and movement this year. Well, no flying chairs this time around, but plenty to read from the ANC's Eastern Cape Elective Conference that took place this past weekend about the state of the governing party ahead of its December elective conference. Earlier, about a couple of hours ago, party president Cyril Ramaphosa closed the conference. Take a listen to what he said about the chaos that our journalists were covering that conference witnessed this past weekend, but also what South Africans were talking about as the conference battled to get to start. But even after it started, there were court challenges and so on. But take a listen to what President Ramaphosa, the ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa, had to say to the party faithful attending that conference, which concluded this afternoon, early evening.
I congratulate you, comrades, because you showed commitment and resoluteness that ensured that this conference took place. Many did not think Uguti is Abakhona Lekomfa. Many thought Uguti it is going to descend into chaos. And even the front pages of some newspapers were saying, Eastern Cape Conference descends into chaos. I am glad you proved them wrong.
ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa making those remarks as he was closing the Eastern Cape's elective conference. I want to bring to the conversation our panel, Ongama Mdimga from Nelson Mandela University, as well as Asanda Nwashe. Good evening to both of you, and thank you very much for being part of this conversation, in fact, for making this conversation work this evening.
Good evening for you and your viewers.
Thank you. I'm going to start with you, Ongama, and the reason, we chose that particular bite, there's another one we're going to play a little later on, was because here was the ANC president praising his comrades for their commitment, for their resoluteness, and saying, other people thought this conference was never going to happen. And then later on, I'm hoping we're going to find this bite as well. He then talks about the fact that there were hardly any discussions there. People spent 4 days essentially talking about electing people.
Yeah, so the problem with ANC politicians is their siege mentality. The view that when people point out potential risks in the party, that's the same as wishing that things would go bad. So it was the reality of the past conference, as well as a number of other conferences, that in fact conferences do degenerate into chaos. But I must commend Vuyo, the changing relationship with due process, procedure, and the law in the conduct of political power within the ANC. There used to be this saying where people would justify the use of political power despite what the rules and processes may say. Siyakuba, when people are moving despite people flagging some challenges within the party. However, through a period of, say, especially intensified in the last decade or so, of members of the ANC challenging the decisions of the party in court, and in fact, on many occasions, winning against, regional or provincial bigwigs who had, gone ahead to run conferences, despite the fact that there were some issues. Now, what you are seeing in terms of the conduct of power, especially administrative power, is a greater sensitivity to, one, the public gaze or the internal gaze of the opponent, and two, the potential legal flaws that may be pointed out in a process. And I'm saying those processes of the experience of litigation has made them to pay due regard to consensus building within the party, and also not push ahead despite complaints that people have about the processes. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, you have a conference that can succeed as far as the leadership selection is concerned. My view is that the party has gotten to a stage where, in fact, maybe since the Polokwane conference, I guess maybe less so in Polokwane actually, because there was a very strong, content in terms of changing from the neoliberal state to a developmental state. But the big issue in that conference was who's going to lead the party. And that's been a theme in the elections of the party for the longest time, where you find that a lot more time is devoted into that question of who's going to lead. And by the way, it's not like they offer any policy or ideological positions which they want to bring to the people, even the rank and file membership, because they're not allowed to campaign, but they get chosen because of the strategic alignments among the elites. Anyway, I think to me, the maturity of the party is in being able to hold the conference. But Oscar Mabuyane was right in saying that greater maturity would be in spending less time on issues of who should be attending the conference and who should be voting the credentials.
Indeed, and as the president said today, Asanda, I mean, they hardly devoted any significant amount of time to actually discussing the things that they should be dealing with: poverty, unemployment, how they're going to get that particular province, you know, out of the doldrums.
Yeah, I think for me, that's the thing that really upsets me as somebody who comes from the Eastern Cape, that we've just had what was supposed to be one of the biggest collections and collectives of the African National Congress, which is the ruling or governing party. And we don't know ideologically where people stand. We don't know what plans this so-called new or old, I suppose, dispensation is essentially planning to implement. So what is Oscar and his slate bringing to the Eastern Cape? What new things, right? So what do they stand for to begin with, just to remind us? And then secondly, what new things are they bringing? We're not clear on that because there was no discussion really. The conference disintegrated, in my opinion, into, you know, the kind of technical discussions about who's supposed to be there and who isn't, and what rules were broken and what rules were not, which I think is important, of course, as Ongama has kind of spoken to. But I think that what is more important is that the Eastern Cape is a province that has high unemployment, that has high hunger, that has high child malnutrition, and that has barely any economic opportunities for its high youth population. And yet the conference that was put together to discuss all of these things and to chart a way forward gave nothing out of that. And for me, it kind of highlights what I've said earlier, that this was not about the Eastern Cape. This was about the national slate and what slate needs to go forward so that people can get the positions that they need in the NEC, so that the big wigs like your Paul Mashatiles, your Zweli Mkhize's, and all the other names that have been mentioned as having a vested interest in the ANC can feel like they are in some ways guaranteed the kind of votes and the kind of numbers that they would need to be in power. And this, to me, is disappointing and saddening when the governing party disintegrates into a kind of voting fodder system when it's meant to be having conferences that discuss very serious matters and discusses the ideological framing and future of the African National Congress in the Eastern Cape, which is a very particular province.
Well, I mean, we're going to play in a short while, a bite from ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa talking about how or what they should now be focusing on. In other words, what should matter to the ANC now? Because he did actually spend a lot of time when delivering his closing address to conference, sort of kind of refocusing, the party, saying, you had the election, you fought among yourselves, there are many things we should be asking ourselves, but right now, this is what we should be doing. This is what should be preoccupying every ANC cadre's mind. Take a listen.
I want to say to the 5 comrades who have been elected here, your mandate is to unite this organization here in the Eastern Cape now that the branches have spoken. It is up to you to assume this mantle of leadership, as well as comradeship and cadreship, and take forward our program of action as spelled out in our January 8th statement. So now you know what the branches expect of you. None of us need reminding that you are coming into your leadership position at a critical time for the province, for our movement, and for our country as a whole. Our foremost task as the African National Congress is to be the servants of our people. As you are elected now, you are now a real servant of the people. to serve. We are also here so that you, as well as the entire ANC here, should be at the forefront of improving the lives of our people and the recovery of our economy through reducing unemployment, eliminating poverty, hunger, and increasing investment and economic growth here in the Eastern Cape.
Do you think he was being listened to, Ongama?
Well, it's interesting that a lot of the leaders paid lip service even to what he's saying. It does happen that, immediately after the conference, people will talk right in terms of, let's build unity, let's work together for the greater good of the province. However, what has been the practice, though, is to want to purge people who are opponents or are perceived to be opponents. And what also happens is that, in fact, save for the Phumulo Masualle era, where you find that national government intervened, there tends to be this, fixation with purging people. He's quite right that the greater majority of the people of the Eastern Cape want the ANC to be not so inwardly focused with debilitating internal battles, but to be focused on the issues that, are pressing for them as far as poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And in fact, if you look at the election results in recent election, in the last three in particular, you'll find that the ANC has lost, in fact, the people in the westerly part of the province and also in the major cities. It's declined in support. And that suggests that those people feel that the party is, especially in municipalities where these debilitating battles have been a lot more pressing, is too much inwardly focused to be concerned about their issues. So for them to change from this trajectory, it would be very interesting. I mean, this same leadership, I think the point was made about how Oscar Mabuyane has been there, when the Nelson Mandela Bay started losing support, and there was no decisive leadership here in order to make sure that this municipality is salvaged from the debilitating problems, Makanda municipality, as well as Ndlambe. So there's a need for a decisive commitment to rebuilding both the party and the state, because what happens at the party level in the Eastern Cape tends to affect municipalities, especially given the fact that the dominant party system is not declining as rapidly as it is happening elsewhere in the country in the Eastern Cape.
Well, Babalo Matigizela, almost immediately after losing, announced that he would be leaving a government, which was interesting, although he did say that it's something he wanted to do about 2 years ago, but didn't get to do it. So he is leaving government. But take a listen, Sanda, to what the ANC president had to say about this phenomenon that Ongama just spoke about.
I wish to congratulate the incoming leadership as led by Comrade Oscar Mabuyane as our chair, Comrade Mlungisi Mvoko as our deputy chair, Comrade Lulama Ngugaitobi as our secretary, Comrade Helen Sauls August as our deputy secretary, and Comrade Zolida Williams as our treasurer. I congratulate you, 5 comrades, but I also, comrades, want to thank those comrades who contested them. I thank them in the manner in which they also carried themselves. That they have not succeeded does not mean that they have lost. That they were not finally elected does not mean that they are not leaders of the African National Congress. I want to say to them, Comrade Matigizela, Comrade Kompela, Comrade Ntutu, Comrade Gotiwe, Comrade Tikana Gotiwe, as well as Comrade Andile Lungisa, that you are leaders of the African National Congress. And we will always see you as leaders. Having not succeeded now does not mean that you will not be given leadership position as you move on. And I want to thank you for the spirit that you displayed, which many of us saw on television, that as soon as the votes were declared, you did come forward and congratulated the comrades who have succeeded. Thank you very much for that.
Asanda?
I think, I mean, I'm laughing because it's actually sad and depressing, the state that we're in. We sit with two chairpersons who suddenly became enemies overnight after being the best of buddies, after being both accused of corruption. And we are made to believe that suddenly the person who's going to be leaving government is doing so out of altruistic values, while at the same time we're being told by the very president of the country that those who have failed are, in some instances, he didn't say the words, but technically what he's saying is they are guaranteed leadership positions. Now, the slate that lost, let's look at some of those names. These are people who have been accused of corruption. These are people who have even gone as far as being in jail. And this is the same ANC that has been telling us about the step aside rule, which says if you have been charged or if you have even gone to prison for specific crimes, that you shouldn't even be able to stand for leadership. And part of the question I have is, how does someone like Andile, who has even seen the inside of a jail cell, find himself in leadership? And how does the ANC justify rubber stamping that leadership to a point where now his name is being mentioned as somebody who the ANC is not going to get rid of or let go of because he didn't win the votes? This is just another reminder that this conference has nothing to do with the people of the Eastern Cape. It has nothing to do with the ideologies that the different sides purport to be supporting. It has nothing to do with the hunger, with the unemployment and the service delivery and the sheer desperation of the people of the Eastern Cape. And it has everything to do with power mongering. It has everything to do with securing seats for the national government and the national ANC. And this is the problem that we have with this country, that we have a governing party that does not care about its people, that is more interested in getting positions for themselves and positions for each other, that is more interested in mudslinging and only revealing corruption and allegations of corruption when it can be used against opponents.
Speaking of Andre Lungisa, speaking of mudslinging, in the context of an ANC president that was saying, there should be unity and people should, do the right things in the interest of both the ANC and the people of this country. Something struck me as we were about to go on air. It was a video that's circulating. Andre Lungisa speaking to his faction, obviously, but before, of course, the voting took place. And he was talking about the man who is now the chairperson of the ANC in the Eastern Cape. And one wonders, Ongama, whether on the back of comments like the one we're going to play now of Andile Lungisa, it's even possible. In other words, what President Ramaphosa was saying is even possible. Just take a listen.
Babengekho bonke abantu ukuthi abakhokhela namhlanje. Bonke ningababala bonke babengekho. Ucomrade Mtungwa welidishi youth league apha eprovincini baza ngekhwapha abo bantu babecela abanye kuthiwa zinkokheli abafana no-Oscar Mabuyane sabanyula basasazo inogodongwana singazibona sathi xa simnyula sathi sinyula itwana ka-Enoch kuzwe kuthi ndenza uba abantu abangayazi history sinixelele sathi xa simfaka sasi-accommodate u-inogodongwana nothi yena.
On the back of those comments, Ongama, is it even possible, for, these comrades to unite when things like those would have been said, in the run-up to the conference? Well, this is basically saying you're not leadership material. We voted for you for very different reasons, and even now we're not convinced that you are, the kind of leader we should have.
Very interesting. So Oscar Mabuyane, in his own right, had in fact led within the student movement at the University of Fort Hare before he joined Enoch Godongwana in his department while he was MEC for, I think, finance in the province. So I guess I thought that he was an administrator in that office between 2002 and 2005, with the big comment in economics. So it's quite interesting. But the point you're making, Bravuyo, you see the trajectories of people in the ANC. It's not been uncommon to have, in fact, been seen at the beginning of your career to have been somebody who belongs to so-and-so. I mean, it's even President Cyril Ramaphosa himself, he initially got to be the Secretary General of the ANC because Slovo and them, the communists, wanted to outfox the nationalists, Zuma and Mbeki. So it's not an uncommon thing to happen that somebody is introduced to a position. I don't want to even enter into whether or not Andile is being truthful. He would have been in COSAS himself at the time, so how he remembers the politics of the Youth League or the early leadership of the ANC in the early 2000s, that's quite interesting. Anyway, it's going to be difficult, not only because of this Bravuyo, but also because, you see, the ANC, because of its untransformed processes of leadership selection, which are done in the open, where each candidate is given a free space to access the rank and file membership and pitch what Asanda was talking about earlier, policy, ideas about how to change whatever the area they are running for office. Because of the lack of that and the fact that people campaign on the basis of alliances across the province from branch all the way to national, it's not going to be possible, especially in an election year. If we were talking about next year, for example, there would be some possibilities because there wouldn't be a major ANC event that's coming. So the point I'm making is that by structure and by design, ANC leadership selection processes are polarizing because they're not done in the open where people can campaign freely. They have to fundamentally be polarizing.
That's where we're going to leave it. Unfortunately, there's a couple of points I still wanted to canvass with both of you, but unfortunately we have run out of time. Special thanks to both our panelists this evening, Asanda Mwasheng and Ongama Mdimka. And that's our show for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow night, same time.